second day of our conference. It's a great honor to have you here. Please, let's give a round of applause to Krista and to Kim for all of their hard work. And also to the students who have been helping the graduate assistants of the Center for Latin American Studies that are assisting in the door and doing other things. Okay, yesterday I brought some notes that I read, and of course I forgot to read something, which is one, because I always forget to thank who I have to thank. And yesterday I forgot to mention that this conference was organized by a collectivity, by a group of professors. So I want to let you know that the organizers are Juliana Restrepo, Cristian Perez, Carlos Suarez, and myself. So that's all I will have to say for the time being. So Carlos, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello to everyone. Okay, welcome all. Today we have met and we have convened to discuss populist challenges to democracy. And I'll be moderating this conversation today. And our three guests today will be Mauro Porto. And Professor Porto is a political communication scholar who studies the linkages between media and democratization with a focus on Brazil. His research has examined the political dimensions of communication practices and genres, including journalism, telenovelas, political advertising, presidential debates, and social media. Also with us, Dr. Vommaro, who's a professor of political sociology at EIDAES, Universidad de San Martín, and research at the Argentina National Research Council, CONICET. And finally, José Miguel Cruz. He's the current director of research at FIU's Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. He's an expert in the area of criminal violence, gangs, police democratization, and public opinion in Latin America. I would like to have all of you welcome our guests, and I will get started with plenty of time for a Q&A once their presentations are over. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like first to thank the University of Florida, the Center for Latin American Studies, and especially to Carlos and all the organizers for the invitation. It's hard shoes to fill to continue the conversation after yesterday, the amazing panel and keynote. So big shoes to fill, but I will do my best to with my presentation. As it's in the program, the title I chose was Status, White Resentment, and the Rise of the Far Right, Lessons from Brazil. And the effort here is to build on my recent book to theorize the concept of political resentment. So how do you move? How do you move the slides forward? Is that... Oh, it should work now. All right. Now I can do this. Thank you. In September 2012, Brazil's most influential magazine published a letter from a reader criticizing the expansion of affirmative action for college admission under the administrations of Presidents Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, both from the Workers' Party, or PT. The letter to the magazine stated, "I studied in public schools and came unprepared to higher education. I had to content myself with a private university. To ensure that my son would have a different history, with a lot of effort, I was able to keep him in the private school network from the start of elementary school to the end of high school. Now he runs the risk of losing a vacancy in a public university for a candidate that's less prepared than him. Is this social justice, President Dilma?" End of quote. We don't know the full identity of the letter's author, but it clearly indicates the social position of a white middle-class parent. The letter refers to the stratified nature of Brazil's educational system. Historically, the children of mostly white families who can afford private and expensive middle and high schools had much greater chances of entering public universities, which are free of charge and generally of much better quality. The letter reflects a sense of entitlement that results from that stratified system. It defines the provision of private education as the natural path to guarantee access to public universities. It also illustrates an attitude of resentment that frames changes in that stratified educational system as unjust and unfair, which are then subject of indignation. The author of the letter predicts that her son, who goes to a private school, might lose a vacancy in a public university for a candidate that is, quote, less prepared than him. This is a clear reference to low-income and mostly Black and brown students that gain unprecedented access to higher education through the expansion of affirmative action during PT administrations. The letter suggests that students accessing universities through the so-called quota system were less prepared than her son, even though research has demonstrated that such students do not have significantly lower scores in the entry exam for public universities when compared to those who access them via general admission. As resentment often does, the letter transforms the bearer of privileges, in this case, members of the white middle class who have preferential access to higher education, into victims of major injustices. The Veja reader illustrates the resentment that gradually spread among the white middle class in Brazil in relation to significant socioeconomic changes that took place during the PT era. Between 2013 and 18, Brazil's white middle class established a new conservative and reactionary movement that included massive demonstrations. The movement led to the 2016 impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff and culminated with the 2018 rise of far-right politician Jair Bolsonaro to the presidency. As I have argued in my book, Mirrors of Whiteness, the rise of the far-right in Brazil is intrinsically connected to the spread of white resentment. This paper starts by revising findings of my recent book about the linkages between resentment and the rise of the far-right in Brazil. The second section reviews debates about notions of resentment in social theory to develop a concept of political resentment that's based on three main constitutive elements. The third and final section outlines the principles for a critical theory of resentment that can enable the identification and the historical processes and social structures that lead to its intensification and political mobilization by the far right. The paper ends by highlighting the ways in which such theory would advance our understanding of the recent rise of conservative movements and the contemporary crisis of democracy. My recent book, Mirrors of Whiteness, argues that several policies implemented during the PT era gradually built resentment among white middle-class Brazilians. Excuse me. The socioeconomic change of the period led to the rise of a sense of existential threat to the middle class. The relative erosion of the historical basis of status and prestige, which had been central to whiteness and middle-class formation, caused a significant status panic in the middle class. Besides the expansion of affirmative action for college admission, the major increase in the real value of the minimum wage and innovative social policies such as Bolsa Família, the family grant, led to unprecedented reductions in poverty and inequality levels, with more than 30 million Brazilians lifted out of monetary poverty. Such improvements in the living conditions of lower status groups allowed them to engage with leisure and consumption spaces and practices that used to be monopolized by the white middle class, spreading anxiety. Another significant policy change was the expansion of labor rights to more than 6 million domestic workers through the adoption of a constitutional amendment in 2013 and a new law in 2015. Several scholars have suggested that the need to comply with labor rights and pay more for their domestic workers generated widespread dissatisfaction and resentment in the white middle class about the social policies of the PT era. The mainstream media played an important role in this key historical moment. My book, Mirrors of Whiteness, identifies some of the ways in which the media representations allow the middle class to legitimate their power while softening or hiding the wretchedness of the inequalities and injustices that such power generates. The book analyzes how representations of domestic workers in the telenovela Cheias de Charme and news coverage of affirmative action by the news magazine Veja reflected and disseminated middle-class resentment, which in turn played a key role in the establishment of the conservative revolt. A cover story about the proposal to expand labor rights to domestic workers, published by the magazine Veja in 2013, provides a vivid example of the role of media representations in the social construction of political resentment. The feature story praised the proposed constitutional amendment under debate in Congress at the time, which was aimed at extending labor rights to domestic workers. The cover includes a picture of a white man wearing an apron over his dress shirt and tie, washing the dishes, which is an iconic representation of a middle or upper class man. His frown forehead and look suggest that he's quite displeased to perform the task. Under the guise of supporting the extension of labor rights to domestic servants, Veja's cover and feature story highlight its negative impact on middle-class families, contributing to build and disseminate resentment about ongoing socioeconomic crisis. It also reinforces a key element of Brazilian whiteness, the elite's strong fear of being left without domestic workers, which have historically become a key marker of middle-class status in Brazil. Recent studies have provided significant empirical evidence about the links between perceptions of status loss, resentment, and the rise of the far right in Brazil. Based on survey data, Ricardo Valente and Julian Borba identify a growing resentment among elites, especially middle-class men, which in turn played a major role in the election of Bolsonaro in 2018. Also based in the analysis of survey data, David Samuels, Fernando Melo, and Cesar Zucco show that respondents who believed that they had lost status under PT administrations exhibited significantly higher levels of resentment against welfare recipients, non-whites, and women, reinforcing political polarization. These and other studies provide robust evidence about the significant role of resentment in Brazil's recent conservative rebellion. The link between resentment and the rise of the far right is not restricted, obviously, to the Brazilian case, but is in fact a central feature of the recent global wave of conservative rebellions. As Wendy Brown has noted, authoritarian-based resentment is one of the most disturbing elements of our times. However, we're still a long way from a comprehensive and critical theory of resentment. Such theorization is essential for a proper analysis of contemporary manifestations of right-wing backlash. To say that we lack a comprehensive theory of resentment does not mean that the phenomenon has been ignored by social theorists. In fact, there is a long-standing line of inquiry about the significance and role of this emotion in modern political philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche's analysis of human morality has been credited as the first comprehensive treatment of the significance of resentment in modern societies. Nietzsche advances a harshly negative evaluation about the impact of resentful feelings, defining them as a psychological disease that characterizes the weak and the mediocre, and that results in evolutionary degradation. Nietzsche's concept of resentment has been criticized for relying on outdated, often poorly digested social Darwinism theories of evolution that reveal an aristocratic contempt for equality. But despite the highly problematic assumptions of his philosophical framework, Nietzsche offered fruitful insights for the analysis of resentment. These insights were taken up by German sociologist Max Scheler in a book published in 1915, which advances a comprehensive analysis of resentment as a feature of modern societies. Scheler goes beyond Nietzsche's evolutionary and aristocratic concept of resentment to link sentiments of hatred and spite to broader social, economic, and political foundations of modernity. Based on these and many other analytical perspectives, I propose a definition of resentment according to three main constitutive elements. First, resentment is a passive type of anger and envy characterized by a sense of impotence. Second, resentment disparages the others and the values they represent. And third, resentment turns victimization into virtue. These elements are discussed in more detail in the paper, but I don't have time to deal with them here. While these three constitutive elements help define and identify resentment as a political emotion, a proper theorization about its role in the rise of the far-right movements and rebellions requires a broader framework. As Vommaro noted, resentment has been too often analyzed as a purely psychological rather than an eminently social condition. The last section of this paper seeks to contribute to the development of such theoretical perspective. Based on lessons drawn from the analysis of the far right in Brazil, the final section of this paper seeks to outline the main requirements for a critical theory of political resentment. The goal is to highlight the social basis of resentment and emphasize its forms of articulation to social forces and structures in historically specific contexts. A first step in the development of a critical theory of resentment is therefore the identification of the historical processes that lead to its intensification and political mobilization. For the purposes of this paper, I argue that two contextual factors are particularly important. First, resentment is more likely to spread in periods of economic transformation or decline. While many factors explain the rise of the far right in Brazil, the economic slowdown that took place during President Dilma Rousseff's administration and the recession that followed are central to understanding the conditions that potentialize the spread of resentment. Contrary to her predecessor, President Lula, Dilma faced a much more difficult international context, characterized by the depression of the international commodity prices. She tried to reverse the economic slowdown by adopting a neoliberal recipe of fiscal austerity and higher interest rates. But inflation rose, private investment fell, and GDP growth tumbled, hindering her ability to continue redistributive policies. As a result, from 2012 to 2013, the middle class shrank while the number of Brazilians living in poverty increased, effectively ending the expansion cycle of the Lula era. In 2015, the first year of Dilma's second term, Brazil fell into a full-fledged economic recession with a negative GDP growth of minus 3.3%. Economic decline and corruption scandals propelled the white middle class to take to the streets through massive demonstrations in 2015 and 16, demanding Rousseff's impeachment, which would eventually take place in 2016 excuse me, through a parliamentarian coup. The politics of resentment that mobilized the Brazilian middle class and that contributed to establishing a conservative rebellion between 2013 and 2018 cannot be understood without reference to this economic context. It's therefore important to analyze how far-right movements are articulated with social economic conditions that led to the material that are related to material and income losses. However, far-right movements are more likely to emerge and thrive not only in periods of recession, but also in processes of reorganization of the economic system. Well before the rise of Donald Trump in the US, Malia Benning identified changes in material conditions that created a fertile ground for the spread of resentment. The shifts include a restructuring of the economic base from manufacturing to service, wage stagnation, and more contingent and lower paying jobs. These trends continue in the US even during periods of economic boom, such as the late 1990s. Such reorganization of the economy was a direct result of the neoliberal turn of the 1980s and 90s, when free market policies and trade agreements undermined the influence of trade unions, promoted further deindustrialization, and led to the financialization of the economy. As several scholars note, there is a significant connection between resentment and neoliberalism. The second aspect that I outline of this critical theory of resentment is the fact that resentment is more likely to spread when status groups feel threatened. In my analysis of the Brazilian case, I deploy Weberian categories of analysis to highlight the many ways in which the middle class evolved as a status group. As I have already noted, some social closure mechanisms have been particularly important in this regard, including those restricting access to higher education. They also include institutions that have played a central role in middle class formation and reproduction, such as the availability of poorly remunerated labor force made up mostly of Black and brown women who work as domestic servants. When policy changes implemented by PT administrations threaten to weaken or eliminate such status-building mechanisms, resentment disseminated among middle-class publics, gradually leading to a significant status panic. The Brazilian case demonstrates that sentiments of resentment can spread not only during periods of economic transformation or decline, but also when new threats to status hierarchies and positions emerge. It's therefore important to stress that in some historical circumstances, resentment emerges not because material or income losses, but because of real or perceived changes in the position of status groups. Perceived threats to status positions help explain how and why relatively privileged groups feel deeply hurt by societal changes and become resentful. The spread of envy, self-victimization, and hostile attitudes often emerge when groups feel a loss of status and prestige when comparing themselves to other groups whose social position has changed or has been perceived to change. German sociologist Max Scheler had already noted that the roots of resentment are always connected to a tendency to make comparisons between others and oneself. Such comparisons are often grounded on socially shared assumptions about honor and respect that lead to certain normative judgments about meritorious and undeserved status positions. When experiencing a sense of decline or stagnation, the resentful will often feel impotent and turn their rage against the others whose status changes is perceived as unmerited and profoundly unfair. There is therefore a significant relation between resentment and the goal of preserving significant or relative privileges. In such circumstances, resentment often moves subjects in the direction of right-wing extremism. As Rory McVey has observed, when social changes disrupt relatively privileged people's capacity to maintain societal benefits that had historically been denied to other groups, they are more likely to abandon mainstream institutions that, in normal times, are sufficient to protect their interests, join instead far-right movements. Based on the analysis of lessons from the Brazilian case, this paper tries to contribute to a critical theory of resentment that highlights the linkages between economic transformation and decline, actual or perceived status losses, and the spread of resentment. The central goal is to enable the analysis of processes by which far-right movements and leaders mobilize such sentiments to organize political rebellions and reconfigure, if not destroy, democratic politics and processes. These are urgent tasks in a global context in which forms of emancipatory politics are under attack by regressive and authoritarian political movements. A comprehensive and critical theory is imperative not only to face these challenges, but also to build collective and effective responses to the toxic manifestations of political resentment that characterize our times. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Carlos, for inviting me in this amazing conference. I'm really glad to be here. I will present the economic crisis and democratic backsliding in Argentina related to the rise of the far right. Probably I will not talk about the comparative perspective, which is closely linked to the Brazilian case, so to Mauro's presentation and also Flavia's yesterday. So maybe we can just discuss about it in the Q&A. Well, as you can see there, the claim is no hay plata. That's the situation in Argentina and the main topic in Milei's discourse. So that's about it's about my talk. So we are witnessing a new surprise in far right in Argentina, since the far right has been electorally weak in this country. There were a strong public presence in the first half of the 20th century through anti-communist and anti-worker movements in this country, but no competitive electoral vehicles was presented in this landscape. So far right has been electorally weak in this country. In this context, the rapid rise of Milei and his electoral vehicle, La Libertad Avanza, is a surprising case that we have to understand. As you know, Milei is an economist graduated from a private university, and he worked in banks and other large companies. But he also was a soccer player, and he also played in a rock music group when he was a teenager. That's important because he's not an elite guy. He's not a rich person, but quite a middle class. He has a middle class background and features. And also, what is important, he began to become popular not from the social media, but from his performance on television. The first of which took place just 7 years before his rise to power. Milei so competed for the first time in 2021 in the midterm elections in Buenos Aires and obtained a third place with 17% of the votes. And he achieved to be elected national deputy at this time. His vehicle, La Libertad Avanza, it's really poorly organized and coordinated, but still it threatened the big coalitional structure of electoral competition in Argentina. But what is important is that this vehicle remains weak and really poorly rooted at the subnational level. However, just 2 years after that, in the 2023 presidential election, Milei won 30% of the national vote with strong showings outside of the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, and just a month after that, in the second round, his support grew to almost 56% of the vote. So collecting mostly the mainstream right candidate votes and became the Argentina first libertarian president. So that's the story about the success of Milei and Milei rise. But Milei can be thought as a hybrid case in several ways. Well, he's a hybrid case of a far-right leader with populist components. I mean, in some way, he defends conservative position on cultural issues, especially against abortion and feminism, although he does so only at certain junctures when he considers that this issue favor his political growth. So it's really opportunistic strategic to vis-a-vis the cultural issues. Also, Milei doesn't maintain a nativist position. His speech doesn't mobilize xenophobic or culturalist nationalism. There's not such a thing in Milei's appeal. One of the main programmatic axes in Milei's appeal is this anti-casta discourse that links directly to the idea of criticizing the corrupt elite to which it opposes pure people, los argentinos de bien. That's important, quite deprived of the fruits of their efforts. So argentinos de bien are people who works hardly and who are deprived of the fruits of their efforts by the casta corruption and taxation. Also, that's important. So also in the security agenda, Milei promotes some conservative features, and sometimes he just promote the self-defense and the free bearing of arms, but that's also intermittent and opportunistic, and doesn't take a key role in his electoral appeal. So how to explain Milei's rapid rise? That's the question. I emphasize how, because why I think it's too early to know why or what explain Milei's rapid rise, but we can reveal the path to power and what kind of mechanism acted in at this process. So my argument is that Milei's rise was driven mostly by a redistributive backlash. That's not means that other factors aren't important, but my point is that redistributive backlash is a crucial factor explaining Milei's rise to power. So what is, in this case, a redistributive backlash? Well, it is generally considered as a reaction to advances in redistribution. But in this case, my point is that it's also a reaction to redistribution failures. So that's important because that generates what I call a redistributive frustration. So frustration can be defined as a situation in which, after decades of expansion of social spending and state intervention, if a part of citizens sees in this expansion not a source of improvement, but a social deterioration. So that reaction addresses two main components: social programs and taxes. So that's the main target of this redistributive frustration, as I will show later. So Milei managed to represent, to a greater extent than the others, and to write options, this redistributive frustration associated with the left. That's important also. So the appeal, Milei's appeal, seems to have been effective for this purpose. So there is 4 elements in my argument. The first is that Milei's rise is preceded by economic setbacks of the incumbent left. That's important. So there is a weakness of the redistributed promise that in some way favors the access of the far right to power. Also, that this economic agenda is a key factor leading to Milei's rise, because Milei managed to connect this libertarian appeal against the state with this idea of this populist appeal accusing La Casta of stealing the fruits of the effort of the Argentinos de Bien. So the anti-casta discourse is really important because that represents a populist performance against political elites and mostly against the left, the incumbent left, sorry. So in this way, I think that Milei expresses best than others this corporate truth of anger and frustration of a good part of Argentinian citizens. But also, that's important that this frustration is organized around strong ideational resources, but a weak organization. So that's also explain why Milei is at the same time a strong leader with weak basis. And the fourth point is that Milei's vote organizes this distributed backlash into fundamental aspects, though. So the rejection of social aid and tax. So I will present these 4 points in three aspects. So the context, the supply side, and the demand side. So to go faster, it's important to know that Argentina had for maybe 10 years a bicoalitional structure of the electoral competition based on ideological alignment, quite unprecedented in this country, where, as you know, Peronism was at the same time the right and the left of the political system. But in this case, the left arm of Peronism and later the building of competitive right-wing party create this big coalitional structure organizing electoral competition for almost 10 years. Okay, so the polarization and the conflict was organized, but the political economy of both coalitions was very weak and began to erode part of their supports. I will go faster and present. So my point is that Argentina arrived at the 2023 elections with an economy in crisis and a society in disarray due to high inflation. Just to go fast, we can see here the inflation rates growth in Argentina from January 22 to October 23, when elections took place, and we can see the path of inflation rates in this country, and we can imagine the effects of inflation in social and everyday life. So as I present the supply side, I just will see will say that Milei's electoral vehicle, La Libertad Avanza, it's a coalition formed by small parties, conservative parties, new parties, small but enthusiastic, activist-based, made up of young libertarians, small conservative groups, authoritarian small groups, but this structure is weak, and Milei does not appear interested in investing in party building as others right-wing leaders. So it's mostly in the ideational dimension that we can see the building of this anti-casta performance, a brand that is synthesizing the rage and the anger, and also this promise of purification and social improvement from the anti-state libertarian program. Just three fast, rapid images illustrating these three elements. This is Milei in a journal in 2018. So that shows how he built a celebrity before social media, in TV, with this disruptive aesthetics and discourse, and also this idea of a performer, an outsider, but also a libertarian performer. That's the lion. That's important because the brand was built around this lion image, and the claim was, vine a despertar leones, no a guiar corderos. That's important. So this political brand was created around dissatisfaction, anger, and frustration. And also the chainsaw plan, the chainsaw program, Viva la Libertad Carajo, it's the claim, but also the idea that through a libertarian program, organizing the anti-casta anger, the Argentinos de Bien would be better. So just to finish, some evidence regarding this frustration. That's was took from the Porto project, what I led with a colleague in Argentina, Gabriel Kessler, sorry, with whom we conducted a focus group in Argentina for 3 months. So that's important that we have this growing and shared rejection of social ed, the planes sociales, but also the rejection of high taxes associated with their negative effect on employment and on people's wealth. So I will show, so that data come from another research with other colleagues. So we can see the Bullrich Milei is the mainstream and the alternative right candidates, and on the left, on the right, we have the Trotskyists and the Peronist candidates, and we can see how social aids divide voters following this pattern, and also some really fast some quotations from the focus group. So, ningún país del mundo prospera con un plan que lo dejas para que se quede. No digo de no ayudar a los pobres, ayudemos siempre, pero hay que dar puestos de laburo, work, trabajo, jobs, capacitaciones interesantes para que tengan un oficio. Creo que hay que sacarlos gradualmente, pero primero hay que sacar un montón de ñoquis del Estado, ñoquis, people who doesn't work, y achicar los sueldos de asesores y políticos. So that's macro voters. Somos unos pocos los que trabajamos para que el resto viva sin trabajar. That's the point. Creo que se ha perdido la cultura del trabajo, que hay generaciones que no han trabajado, ni los abuelos, ni los padres, ni los hijos. Lo que debe haber, lo que se debe hacer, es generar políticas de trabajo, empleo, no planes. Los planes no tienen que ser a perpetuidad. Me parece que sí hay que ayudar a la gente, como puede tocar a mí el día de mañana, pero hasta cierto punto. Es como los hijos, los ayudás, pero a caminar, salvo que haya una situación excepcional. Con laburo, with jobs, no con planes. Taxes is the same situation. I go fast. And then we have also some verbatims to share, but here we can see the same pattern as in the social ed issue, and also this idea, estos tipos de gobierno, the Peronist, lo que les importa es atacar a los que supuestamente tienen dinero, pero sin darse cuenta de que los que tienen dinero son los que tienen riquezas. Entonces limitás al que supuestamente tiene dinero y le impedís que genere empleo. Así como nosotros trabajamos, supongo que el tiempo en que ellos, los empresarios, trabajaron, también tuvieron que trabajar. No es que el gobierno les regaló la plata. Y ahí habla sobre that he talked about the president of the for industry. So, así como nosotros perdimos durante la pandemia, muchos de los que tienen ahora también perdieron porque no había empleo. No digo que esté mal que les pidan plata, pero tampoco obligarlos. We can ask, but okay, no enforce rich to pay. Y meterles la mano en el bolsillo. Porque es que ellos no es que ellos no pagan impuestos. Sin empleo, seguir pagando el sueldo a los trabajadores y además pagar impuestos y que los políticos no se saquen el sueldo, me parece un chiste. Well, I will stop here. Thanks for your attention and sorry for the mess, but it's a work in progress, so a really complex object. And yeah, that's also an in progress situation. So thank you.
Well, I want to start by thanking University of Florida, Carlos, Kim, and all the Center for Latin American Studies here for the invitation, and happy to be here sharing this table with Mauro and Gabriel and Carlos. So what I'm going to do is try. My presentation is also a kind of work in progress. It's part of I published an article about this, but I'm expanding it to make more sense of the recent events in Central America, particularly in El Salvador, about how the fight against crime and gangs basically have allowed Bukele particularly to restore authoritarianism in El Salvador. What you see is the structure of the presentation. These are 4 general points I'll be talking about. First, the persistence of violence in Central America. Second, the importance, in order to understand what is happening right now, the importance of the transitions to democracy and the people's expectations related to those transitions. Third, the role of the old regime operators. And finally, the infamous, I would say, Bukele model of how to fight gangs. Basically, my argument, and this is it's an argument that Cecilia, mi paisana, my fellow countrywoman from El Salvador, basically outlined yesterday, which is in Northern Central America particularly, instead of seeing a backsliding to authoritarianism, what we're seeing is sort of authoritarian restoration, right? Remember, this country, most of the countries in Central America, they had never had democracies in the past. And we, for so many different reasons, historical reasons, we have a sort of break of that during the 90s and 2000s, especially in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and to some extent in Honduras. So what we're seeing right now, instead of that backsliding, is a restoration of authoritarianism. And this happens through all regime political elites who use the fight against crime to undermine the democratic reforms from the very start. So as soon as we had the transitions to democracy or to, at least electoral democracy, what we had was, the elites started working to undermine those reforms. And this combined effect of the watered down reforms and systemic political corruption during the democratic period basically delegitimized commitments to democracy from the population. Nayib Bukele basically skillfully used those things to remain, basically to build his popularity and now remain in power. So this is for me, this is a key element of what is happening right now. And this is that violence has been a persistent problem in Central America for decades. And let me show you this. These are the homicide rates in 3 different Latin American regions, right? Mexico and Central America, the Southern Cone, and the Andes. Not all the Latin American countries are here. In Central America and Mexico. In the Andes, basically Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. In the case of the Southern Cone, basically is Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. And you see the story of 3 different regions, right? Andes and Central America and Mexico, with ups and downs in terms of violence, including political violence, including wars, right? And in the Southern Cone, in a very different story, even though, as you can see lately, in the Southern Cone, things have been kind of going up. But in Central America, we have lived with violence and brutal violence for many years, right, in decades. And actually, what happened also is that criminal violence, after the political violence and the wars ended, criminal violence increased, right, after the political transitions, right? So for the population, it was this sensation that, okay, we still have violence. We ended political violence, but now we're dealing with criminal violence. I'm going to try to explain that a little bit quicker. Let me jump on this. So why political transitions are important here? Well, in the 90s, Central America underwent political transitions, civil wars ended, the security apparatus were reformed, and this is particularly important because the guys who were in control of the security apparatus were the military, and the military were removed as part of the transition, right? The military were removed, and civilian police and civilian security forces were created and were charged with now providing security. And at the same time, you have political liberalization and democratization in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And this was best shown in the electoral arena, right? You have really open and fair elections, and electoral institutions work quite well, right? So everything seemed good. But from the very beginning, political elites and all regime operators maneuvered to stop and undermine institutional reforms, especially in the criminal justice system and security apparatus. Why? Because most of the people responsible for human rights abuses in the past, during the wars, were in those security institutions, were in the military, were in the intelligence apparatus, they were there, right? But from the very beginning, they started trying to undermine those reforms. Security bureaucracies view alliances with corrupt politicians as an opportunity to thwart substantive reforms that will make institutions more transparent, right? So even though we're having, free and fair elections, right, and the electoral institutions were working well, right, at the same time, in the security apparatus, they were maneuvering to stay close to power, even though the military and some of them were formally removed, right? But they were, staying around. This is the old idea, Charles Tilly idea of the violent entrepreneurs who were still there. They remained there, right? So political elites at the same time were willing to protect them in exchange for intelligence and safety, right? Even those rising new political leaders will hire back again those former intelligence officers, those military, right, to help them to control some of the population. So what happened was that violent entrepreneurs from the past remain embedded in security institutions. And you have the continuation of some kind of informal armed groups associated with state structures And some of them actually migrated to criminal organizations they connect them, those criminal organizations, right, with political elites, right, with the rising political elites, right? So what you have is in some ways these corrupt alliances, right, to protect those former abusers of human rights. And you can see, for instance, in El Salvador in 1994, 2 years after the peace accords, former military intelligence officers were appointed as head of elite investigative units in the new civilian police, basically the same people. And in Guatemala, former officials who had been demoted for participating in coup attempts and kidnappings in the 1980s, in early 90s, were brought back as leaders of the new police institutions established in 2000. So the same people, right? Same operators were still there. Now, how they also work the way to influence politics? Well, they use a lot of these narratives. The accountability in the security apparatus hinder the fight of crime. If you want to fight crime, no, don't monitor the security forces. I mean, we should be able to do whatever we want in order to fight crime. So, and this is the moment in which in the 90s, you start seeing this idea of, these new democratic kind of penal laws were garantistas, right? They were trying to protect delinquentes, criminals, right? So, and this is important because as soon as, the wars ended, you start hearing this idea that human rights are a problem to combat crime, right? And this is coming from those same people who were accused of abusing human rights in the past. And societies need mano dura to combat crime. So what are the implications of this? So, the guerrillas were gone, right? Or they were now in the political parties. You cannot blame guerrillas anymore or the leftists because now we have open societies. So who is the new public enemy? The kids, the gangs, right? And what you're seeing over there is a picture of MS-13 members and 18 street gang members in El Salvador in 1996, basically celebrating a sort of barrio, neighborhood level peace accords between them, right? And you can see both of the gangs over there, the Amara Salvatrucha with the guy with this sign and the 18 street gang with this sign. I mean, they were celebrating, and they were basically kids. Now, the identification of the new public enemy is imply basically coming up with some new suppression programs in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And actually, things started not in El Salvador, but in Guatemala with something that they call the Operación Escoba, Operation Broom in 2000. Then the next one was Honduras with Operations Blue Liberty and Zero Tolerance. But actually, the Salvadorians, we basically were the ones have sophisticated more the approach, and launched something that we call the mano dura, and then also the super mano dura, because mano dura wasn't enough, so we wanted to be super duper mano dura, right? And this is why you see the deployment of the mano dura in El Salvador, July 2003, right? And actually, these are the first results of the mano dura in August 2003, right? You have some of these kids, some of them gang members, some of them don't, as the first capture, right? What happened? I'm not going to go into this because I don't have too much time, but basically what I'm going to show you is that the mano dura, particularly in El Salvador, was a complete disaster, right? What happened after the mano dura is that the mano dura gave the opportunity to gangs to reorganize, right, to getting more sophisticated, right? And actually, after the mano dura in 2003, you see the rise of crime, basically of homicide and extortions, right, as a result of the mano dura campaigns in El Salvador. In Guatemala and Honduras happened something similar, but since El Salvador was a more sort of broad and more systematic approach to this, it had the most, it had the largest effect in the region. So after 10 years from this picture, right, this is 1996, a photographer called Isabel Munoz went into the Salvadorian prisons and took these pictures. And this is the pictures that we know now how about this is the image, so rather, that we have had about the gangs in Central America, right? These guys with the tattoo, the guy on the left, MS-13, and the guy on the right, or the 18 street gang, right? So enter Nayib Bukele, right? This is some years later, right? And he claims to political power, to power as a political outsider, right? He presents himself as a political outsider, although he's not. He's coming from the FMLN. He's coming from one of the former guerrilla party, right? But he is very skillful in the use of communication in social media, and he presents himself as the new face, the new politician, right? And he basically uses this, at this point now, profound disaffection toward the political system and traditional parties, because they haven't been able to solve many problems, but especially the problem of crime. And quite rather, crime has gone up, right? Especially in El Salvador. But this is similar story in also in terms of the rise of crime in the other two countries, in Guatemala and Honduras. When he took office, basically, Nayib Bukele pursued a two-pronged strategy. And this is something that you don't hear too much in the media, in the propaganda, because basically he's very skillful in sending the images or the messages that he wants. First, he negotiated with the gang leaderships, right? And this is a practice that actually was started way before him by all the other political parties of negotiating in order to reduce crime, right? He continued with that practice. He continued with that practice when he became the mayor of San Salvador, right? He did use that in order to be able to beautify the downtown San Salvador, right? He had to negotiate with gangs in order for the gangs to allow him to do what he wanted to do. So he started that practice. He continued that practice when he became president. But also he implemented something that he called the territorial control plan and the war on gangs. So he had this kind of a two-lane approach, right, of how to deal with crime. So at the same time he was hammering the gangs publicly in the streets, he was negotiating with the leadership of those gangs, right? And what you have here is a picture of when he launched the territorial control plan. He uses a lot of this imagery, kind of fascist imagery of having the security forces online, and he's delivering speeches, right? And he uses that. And the other picture is some pictures that were basically got by Del Faro, by an investigative news outlet, basically who they uncovered the negotiation between the government and the gangs, right? And some people strongly believe that the guy on the right, who's covered, is this Nayib Bukele, by the way, when he was in prison negotiating with the gang leaders. So, because he was engaged in this negotiation with gangs, the way gangs related to him is that when they wanted to have more benefits from the government, they increased the levels of violence. They kill more people, right? In March 2022, basically, MS-13, the Mara Salvatrucha, miscalculated their strategy, and they increased in one weekend the level of homicides, right? They they basically launch a wave of violence resulting in more than 70 homicides during a weekend, right? Because of that, the reaction of Bukele, and also thinking in that the elections were approaching, basically, he launched what is now called the state of exception, right? And according to, and this state of exception, just basically entail the suspension of freedom of assembly and association, suspension of the rights of the same person to be informed or reason for his detention or her detention, detention without the need of a court order or the person committing a crime, extension of the maximum time of administrative detention. It went from 72 hours to 15 days, meaning that you can be detained, but first you have to wait 15 days in order to see a judge. And when you see a judge, actually, you will see it along with other 500, 900 people at the same time, right? And all of them will be accused massively of being in gangs, right? So as a result, you have this. I think you have seen all these images, right? I mean, all the people in prison. So as a result, more than 80,000 people detained in a year, with the highest rate of imprisonment in the world, way higher than here in the United States, which here in the United States we're good for that, for imprisoning people, right? Well, El Salvador is even better, right? Local human rights organizations documented more than 2,000 serious human rights violations. Some of them indicated more than 35% of detainees have no prior criminal record, and people have reported higher sense of security, however, in the communities, which is the base for his popularity. So let me just so you can see, I mean, what Bukele is doing is nothing new in El Salvador, basically, but he's doing it very well in terms of imagery, right? And in terms of political messaging, right? Because this is something similar that we tried in 2003, and now he's doing in 2022, right? Political implications, high levels of approval, state of exception as part of electoral campaign, erosion of democratic guarantees, which also serves his purposes because basically he allows now with the use of a state of exception, he also sends messages to his political enemies telling them how they could end. With the collaboration of some of these old political entrepreneurs from the past. Actually, the current director of the police in El Salvador was member of the military during the war, right? For instance, decline in essential freedoms, association and expression, and unconstitutional re-election, which you just witnessed last month. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Okay, very well. Thanks to the three of you for educating us on this significant wave of changes in the region. I have questions for the three panelists, and it's just intended to get things started. If you want to address the questions, go ahead. If not, you can ignore them. But just to elicit a conversation and get the ball rolling, and then I'm assuming we'll have a microphone for the audience, I would imagine, or we do. Okay, very well. So for Dr. Porto, I have a number of questions. And the first one is there something of this white resentment that's uniquely Brazilian, right? Can we point to some elements of this white resentment that we can say it's different than what we see in the US, it's different than what we maybe see in Spain with Vox, you name it, right? What makes it uniquely Brazilian, if anything? Also, you mentioned that the PT policies triggered a lot of this resentment. And you mentioned a material component, which was when they had to pay more for their domestic help, right? That was the material element that impacted their pockets. But it seems that besides this and the affirmative policy actions for college, it seems to be mostly symbolic. So my question is, Is it mostly material? Is it symbolic? Is it a hybrid? Is it both? And then my last two questions. You mentioned that most of this resentment was a product of the policies during the Dilma period and not first Lula, if I understood correctly. If that's the case, is it a function of what you explained that it had to do with the economic downturn during the Dilma period, or was it an element of gender, the fact that it was Dilma and not Lula? So those are the questions that I have for Professor Porto. I will do the same with the two other speakers, and then I'll open up the floor once the actually. Would you like to address them now, or should I go with the other two? Go with the other two. Okay, fair. With Dr. Vommaro, I have a number of questions as well. What were the conditions that make the historically electorally weak right finally rise to power, right? You addressed the role of Peronism basically consuming the 20th century. What finally changed? Because Argentina has seen significant episodes of inflation in their past, right? Is it that this one, the inflation was way worse than ever? That maybe gave a rise to that political right in the elections. Also, what makes Milei's populism uniquely Argentinian, if it's such a thing, right? Is there something that you could argue, hey, this is only found in Argentina, or it could be Argentina, or it could be generalizable to other parts of the region, right? We saw Bolsonaro or Trump here, you name it. And then one aspect that I find quite peculiar is the image of the motosierra, right? The chainsaw. And he has been quite clever in the use of the image of the motosierra de León and all this political branding. If you don't mind, I would like to hear more about that exercise of branding and who were his advisors. We have read anecdotally, me on the press, the role of his sister, right? Who were the creators of this imagery of the León, the motosierra? Who were the brains, if you will, behind those strategies? Okay, and then finally for Dr. Cruz, you talked about authoritarian restoration, right? And my question is, why now, right? Why now? Why not 15 years ago? Why now? Also, I know that you have addressed the literature in transition to democracy, and of course, the key component of that literature is consolidation. And with the degree of violence that you showed in your presentation, can we argue that El Salvador ever consolidated democracy? Because I think that's a fair question, right? With those degree of violent statistics that you showed, did he ever actually consolidate it? And then another aspect, you mentioned the case of Guatemala, and I know that they had a Comisión de la Verdad, and it's an aspect that I would like to hear more. Did they play any role in putting a dent on the power of these elites that perpetrated a lot of this violence and now came back to power? And my final one is, when you talk about the state of exception, are you thinking more of the classical Schmidt notion of state of exception, or more current Giorgio Agamben based on what we saw in the US as a response to 9/11? So those are my questions, if you don't mind responding in the order in which I made them. And then, of course, the floor is yours.
Is it working? Hello, hello. Yes. Oh, yes. All right. Thank you, Carlos, for the questions. What's uniquely Brazilian? Well, I don't know yet. I think what I'm thankful for the invitation to come here is because I'm trying to think about how the heuristic value of my book and its framework to think about other cases, right? And obviously, since I'm arguing about a historicized and contextualized analysis of white resentment, there is always something unique, right? In every case, how these forms of resentment are articulated, right? So, but what I think is uniquely Brazilian is how strongly is the social historical evolution of the middle class as a status group, not only in terms of economic conditions and social class positions in the economy, right? But so, for example, some of you are familiar with the classification of social classes in Brazil, which comes from the advertising agency. classes A, B, C, D, E, and E, right? A is the wealthiest class, E. So when Lula's policies lifted people out of poverty, they called it the new class C. It has to do with that classification. So how do you define who are the members of classes A, B, C, D, E? Obviously, income. Obviously, it's the usual stratification measure. But the key criteria used in that index is the education level of the head of the family, which means that college diploma is a key marker of middle-class identity, right? So, and public opinion polls and focus groups show that, for a lot of Brazilians, how do you decide who is middle-class, who is not? College diploma is a marker, right, of an identity marker. And the second is few people notice, right? And Luis Almeida from USP pointed to that another criteria is the goods in the household, right? Your purchasing power is demonstrated. Do you have refrigerators? Do you have microwave? Do you have a car? Do you have, right, good electronic goods? And one of the goods is, do you have a domestic worker in the household? So it not only objectifies the domestic worker, but transforms her as a symbol of status. So there is no, and this association between status and notions of honor and prestige that's strongly grounded in the inequalities that you find in society. I think that's very strongly, you can see that, I would call that uniquely Brazilian attachment to status markers that are central to understand what's going on. And then the question is, to what extent the reaction to PT policies as symbolic or material? And one of the things I was arguing in the paper is that obviously these are distinctions that are analytical, but in reality, things are much more complex and they intersect, right? The material and the symbolic intersect. And of course, the reaction to Dilma and her unconstitutional impeachment is related not only to material losses, but also to anti-gender attitudes. Obviously, there's a good study, I'm horrible with names, I would not remember the author, who analyzes memes that circulated during the impeachment process that demonstrated the misogyny of the impeachment campaign, right? Dilma was allegedly culprit to be blamed not only for her actions, but also by what she was, her alleged lesbianism, her alleged attachment to GLBTQ groups and so on. So it's complicated. I would say that, right? And the argument, finally, if it was more reaction to Dilma and Lula, no, my argument is that resentment builds silently and over time, right? And most of the resentment of the white middle class built in the Lula era, the key transformations of Lulismo as a political project. And of course, when Dilma extended some of these reforms, including the extension of labor rights to domestic workers, that was under her term. And that was the drop on the bucket that, mobilized the middle class.
Thank you, Carlos, for your questions that allow me to make some clarifications about the Argentine case, the Argentina case. So, regarding the context, what changed in this case? Well, I've been working for many years on the building of the right-wing parties and movements in Argentina. That's new. We have a new competitive party called Pro. We have a conservative influencer. So the supply side of the right in Argentina grows strongly in the last 2 decades. And also the conservative constituency growth. So we have more voters identified with the right. That's also important. And lastly, for the first time, we have a center to the left of movement. So Peronism turned to the left that also count in this case. So to go fast, what's unique in Milei's populist appeal? Well, as you say, Milei's case joined other populist, right-wing populist cases in Latin America, but I think the unique element in his appeal is this libertarian, open and strongly libertarian element. That's different from Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's even different from Cast in Chile and well, other cases as even Trump in US. So last, third and last question. Yeah, well, yes. There is a small group of young libertarians really strong in media, social media, communication, working with Milei in the last 3 or 4 years, creating this branding and this strong appeal. That's participate from this renewal of the right and the alt-right in the world. So they are really ironic and against the mainstream and the politically correct. That's the same as the young conservative influencers in Europe or the alt-right in US. In this case, Milei also has these young libertarians helping him to build this strong brand. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos, for those great questions. Why now? Why? Well, in the case in El Salvador, because now, because for some years after the peace accord, basically where you have a very stable political party system with the right and the left, right, competing for power, right? Nayib Bukele rises as a result of the profound disenchantment with that political system, right? And that's, but for many years, you know, these all regime operators were trying to get into, you know, into basically dismantle that, but they weren't able because you have these two big parties who basically check on each other. Let me say this. I mean, these operators from the past were both in the both political parties, and they were trying to do it. But since you have a strong opposition force in the other party, they check on each other and were able to do that. What allows Nayib Bukele to do what he's doing is that after the right and the left had governed, and basically they have shown very poor results, he's able to say, see, these guys didn't help you at all. So I'm the one who's going to do it, is able to sort of go against them without any checking on his power. And that's really also to your other question, what in the other countries, actually authoritarian restoration occurred earlier in the other two countries, I would say. In Honduras occurred in 2009 with the coup d'etat, the military coup d'etat in 2009. And it happens because basically this is when you have a kind of left in Honduras trying to govern, and then the military and some alliances in the right basically stage this coup d'etat. And this is where you can see clearly the association between the old regime operators in Honduras, basically bolstering the conservadores in Honduras after the coup d'etat. And the result is what you have right now in New York with the former president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, being on trial because of his association with the criminal groups in Honduras, right? In Guatemala, actually, also there was a sort of earlier, a stronger attempts of authoritarian restoration that were being to some extent successful because Guatemala didn't have this strong party system that El Salvador and Honduras had. So, and this is where the CICIG comes, and CICIG starts helping the Guatemalans in building this criminal justice system, right? They were so effective that they were pushed out by the elites, right? And that's why you see these basically the last 4 or 5 years, right, of instability in Guatemala, right, till the very end, right, in which Bernardo Arevalo wins the election, but we'll still have to see whether those old forces are going to, they're going to reconstitute, and my fear is that, you know, they won't allow him to govern. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have, thank you.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I have 3 questions. The first one is for Gabriel. I was wondering, thinking about this sort of this redistributive backlash and the idea of redistributing failure, what is the role of patronage in the efforts to redistribute in this, what is the effect of patronage, right? Like, so the criticism that I hear from people who would support Milei or think better about Milei, whatever you want to put it, is that it's not that yes, it's the economic situation, but it's the economic situation and the perception that Peronism has controlled the state. Like the language is like mafias, and like that's a language used to describe people inside the state, right? And the idea that they have taken over and is not only that they have failed to distribute, is that they distribute only to their own people, right? So what is the role of that idea in feeding into this backlash, right? And I had a question about sort of El Salvador. I was listening to Jose Miguel's presentation, and I was thinking, oh, that's Colombia. I can just switch the name and put Colombia, right? Like it's years of violence, pervasive, a mano dura approach in the early 2000s from a person who presents as an outsider, but really is not. And yet we don't see the same outcome, right? So going in line with this idea of why now, what the variation, what makes Bukele so incredibly successful in eroding democracy, right? Like, what is it? Because sort of these narratives about Manadura and these narratives about undermining opposition and democratic rules, like undermining human rights. I can see Álvaro Uribe talking about terrorists and every single NGO, right? So I was thinking, what has made Bukele's rise and sort of co-opting of power and same power so fast, so easy, right? And in line with that, I was also, so you say that Bukele is implementing the same strategies from the past, which I agree, and that he has been successful in the media, but that's not what it sounds like from independent reporting, even from El Faro, like, you know, that say that he has actually decreased crime, right? Like the numbers speak by themselves. So what has done Bukele that the previous people didn't do? Like, why is mano dura, quote unquote, and I understand this is at a huge cost in human rights, I'm not defending this, worked for Bukele and not for the previous ones?
Okay, well, thank you for your question, Laura. I think there are, well, many important elements to add in order to answer your question. I will add just 2 main points. The first is corruption. That's important. I didn't mention corruption, but corruption scandals, and even in the middle of the campaign, you have a scandal which shows what the casta was. former, well, maybe the chief of minister of the province of Buenos Aires was in a yacht, a boat, with a model with girls and expensive things, so in Europe during the campaign. So that's well, that's it's not hard to imagine what a casta is in this case, So many scandals like this contribute to create this image of some political elite capturing the state for their own benefit. So, but because that became to add many layers of corruption during Peronist administration, but also during Macri's administration. So that's the perception is really rich. Also the Mason right, showing that the casta is the same, right or left, Peronist or non-Peronist. The whole system was corrupted and is the same. And also, the Peronist was the most important target of this, and well, I can add other elements, but we have no time. So the other point is that there is a public-private divide also in Argentina, more than the formal-informal divide. Public sector, mostly since the COVID pandemic, is seen as the privileged, the people who has privilege, comparing to private sector who had to work hard and who had to face restrictions to work during the pandemic without a salary. So that's also create a strong feeling against the state, against public workers, against the what we can call public privilege. So that's also important in this case, that full the anti-state feeling. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, very relevant. Why so far? What makes him so successful? Right, basically, your question. I would say three things. First, and I was referring to it to some extent, is his skillful use of communication and massive communication propaganda. I don't think even Uribe wasn't that deftly in using social media and all the resources for propaganda in the way that Bukele is. And he's a publicist. Actually, he was a publicist. He had a marketing agency before getting into politics. So he uses all that. So that's an important factor. But then what makes specifically the state of exception, his war against gangs, so successful? I would say two reasons. First, that actually he implemented these two approaches at the same time: negotiation and mano dura, right? Both of them were used in the past, but not at the same time. So the best example is the government of the FMLN, which negotiated with gangs at the national level with the truce in 2012, right? And they were negotiating, and homicides went down. But with gangs, they started, demanding more, and they started pushing the government by killing police, military, soldiers, and basically the FMLN decided to, stop negotiation and go in a total war against gangs, right? So they moved from one to the other. What Bukele did was he negotiated at the same time he's doing all and showing all those pictures of gang members in prisons and almost being tortured, right? At the same time, he is negotiating with the leadership of those gangs and taking them out of prison. And this is documented. I mean, you can find this is documented. He took the leaders who were in prisons, he took them to Guatemala and to Mexico, where, by the way, have been captured by the Americans, and they are now here, right? And they are singing, right, all about their negotiations with Bukele, right? So what he did is, instead of negotiating first and then going to war, right? He's doing these two things to avoid a sort of national war or backlash from the gangs against him. So he basically benefits the gang leaders, right? While at the same time puts all these, mid and low level gang members in prisons and saying, look what I'm doing, right? But you don't hear about, the negotiations in the propaganda or in the media, obviously not, right? What you see is the mano dura. So that's the other thing. And the third reason here is that his implementation on this total mano dura implies also that there are no, in the past, the mano dura, when the previous governments implemented mano dura, you still have independent judges, right? And independent that will take some of the people out, including some gang members out, right? And because there were no proofs against them, and there were some kind of guarantees, constitutional guarantees. Now he controls absolutely everything: the Supreme Court, the justices, the Assembly. So there's nothing that can detain his power, actually. So that allows him to implement a sort of total mano dura with everybody, right? Which didn't happen completely in the past.
Thank you for the panel. My questions, I think that they go mostly for Mauro and Gabriel, but maybe José will also have some comment on it. So Mauro talked about resentment, politics of resentment. Gabriel mentioned anger, dissatisfaction, and I think it's easy for us to see anger, to see dissatisfaction. Also, if we think of the insecurities and how people feel as they face violent contexts, but not only. What I'm trying to think and understand, and would love to hear you about that, is how dissatisfaction or anger plays into class positions and also conflicts. Because as we try to unpack it, sometimes it's difficult because white resentment refers to middle class resentment. And this could connect to Gabriel's data on the resentment against social policy, social district policy in Brazil, the quotas in public universities that Mauro mentioned. But at the same time, Mauro, for example, mentioned Wendy Brown and how neoliberalism produces resentment. And as neoliberal politics in contexts of economic crisis adds to the uncertainties that people feel, we could say that it makes the life of low middle class and poor people and the most vulnerable harder. So they could have a kind of resentment that is not the same resentment that middle class has. So we have these changes kind of producing outcomes that the far right captures. So it's just to finish, maybe like, is the far right promoting an idea of people, of demos, that cuts across distinct experiences of dissatisfaction? Like, are they being able to do something that other political groups are not being able to do? Like, they are capturing these distinct resentments built on different issues and making something that is working. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavia. That's the question, right? The key question that I think we haven't theorized yet and empirically studied in more detail, right? So I like this idea that maybe what's peculiar about the far-right movements is their ability to tap into different forms of resentment in different social groups and build a political project that appeals to those resentments, right? So, and it's not just one or the other, right? So back then, the sociologist, the German sociologist Max Scheler had already said that resentment is a key feature of modern societies because there is a conflict between the ideology of equality, right? We are equal citizens, and the reality of inequality. We are experiencing this all the time. And even though the promise of equality is beautiful, the reality of inequality is prone to generate resentment, right? That some people are more equal than others, and this is not working for me. And then when you see, and the question then is very difficult one is how these things intersect, right? So how feelings of economic class loss articulated with sense of loss, of fear of falling, right, to the lower classes, and witnessing someone next to you allegedly improving their social economic conditions while you are not. And then you come with these notions of undeserved achievements, right? That they don't, that is reflected also in the focus group quotes that Gabriel brought. So, and then you have the even more interesting thing is that the intersection comes also with neoliberal policies that if you have an economic restructuring like in the US, where men used to be the bread, and you brought data about what I think I have to look more carefully is one breadwinner, two breadwinners, right? Who is working to sustain the family. When you have an economic transformation that men lose the ability to play the traditional patriarchal image of the breadwinner, and men start witnessing more successful women in business and politics, and right? So is that just economic, or is just gender, or is it the articulation of both, right? And I think it's the intersection of both. And I think that's what we need to, I think, understand more, theorize more, and I have no answers. I'm just starting to think those questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Flavia, for your questions. Well, that makes me think about well, two points. I think dissatisfaction, anger is linked to class in a manner, but as we can assess up to now, so far the gender divide and the age divide is more important in Argentina than the class divide related to those things. And also, as I answer to Laura's question, the private divide, it's also really, really important. So because Milei's voters are really came from different classes. So it's not the traditional vote of the right in the upper classes, but also middle classes and lower classes voting for Milei. So yeah, I think gender divide, generation divide, and public-private divide are the main factors shaping the organization of anger and disaffection in Argentina, in current Argentina. And well, your question about the idea of people, it's hard to answer, but I think Milei, it's really strong trying to do that in this idea of the Argentinos de bien, opposite of to the casta. So this populist appeal try to build some shared experience of people feeling insecurity, feeling anger and disaffection vis-a-vis the economic situation and inflation rates. So that also gender issues in a minor way, but that's also important. So yes, I think we witness some attempt to build a conservative idea of people with this populist component linked to the Argentinos de bien versus the casta. And casta is public sector is left, Peronist, well, feminist also. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for these three very interesting papers. I have some questions for all of you. So let me start with you, Mauro, and it's a follow-up to Flavia's question. I really like your engagement of trying to construct a critical theory of resentment. But my only concern is that we have been thinking about resentment only applying it to right-wing extremism or right-wing populism. But you also have resentment that is sparked or that is thematized by left-wing populists. I mean, Abdallah Bucaram in Ecuador say, a vote for me is like scratching a Mercedes-Benz. A vote for me, I mean, all of this hatred to the upper class. So it will be important to incorporate in a general critical theory of resentment, also the resentment of that left populists are able to engage. Then to Gabriel, you show very well that Milei has a very strong populist, ideational, and performance component, but he's very weak organizationally. Is that being supplied by the traditional right, by Macri's party? Are they the ones who want to capitalize on that? And then to Jose Miguel, a question that it's impossible to answer anyways for me, is how can you have a democratic response to crime and insecurity? Because the Milei example is being followed all over Latin America, and especially in Ecuador now, and I'm really concerned about that. But I don't know how you can, I mean, because crime rates, you know, homicides go up and people need security, and the only security that they get is through the declaration of a state of emergency, state of siege, or declaring these groups terrorists.
Thank you, Carlos. This is an excellent question because it allows me to talk about what I haven't mentioned, right? Is what's the relationship between the left or progressive movements with resentment, right? And in the section that I discussed the concept, I show that there are different definitions of resentment. So even back there in Adam Smith, in the theory of moral sentiments, he highlighted that resentment is potentially a progressive force in a democracy because it mobilizes people to struggle to redress injustices, right? But as long as it's kept checked. So some scholars distinguish between moral political resentment and ontological resentment. That's more the Nietzschean view of the evil, strong resentment. But So in other words, not every form of anger and is anti-democratic. It's the core of every social justice movement is, this hatred for inequalities and injustices. The problem is then when resentment becomes this disempowering sentiment that leads to scapegoating and always finding someone else who is to be blamed by your condition. But what I think is the deep flaw of progressive leftist movements around the world is the way in which they dismiss the resentment, right? And do not try to understand it and tap into its causes. So there's an interesting book about, for me, the key question in the US that explains the rise of Trump is his victory in the Electoral College is the upper Midwest, right? The Rust Belt, devastated by neoliberal trade agreements and policies. So there is a scholar, John Hartigan, wrote this book, Racial Situation, about Detroit, which shows that the left has this tendency to see any form of resentment forming in white communities, because the upper Midwest is overwhelmingly white, as an expression of racism, right? So, and when white former working class people that lost their jobs, their plants are closed, and now they're working McDonald's, and they, and you frame their concerns about immigration, right? Only as an expression of racism, right? You are failing to understand their social condition and the processes of transformation that are happening there. And you are throwing them in the laps of the far right, right? And I think this is one of the main failures of the left, is not to understand the moral political resentment that Adam Smith talked a lot about. It's to understand how ontological resentment in the Nietzschean sense spreads and how to prevent it to become only a tool for the right. I don't know if I answered that.
Thank you, Carlos, for your question. Well, in fact, it's what is going on right now. The mainstream right seems to be the most important ally, Milei's ally. But I don't know if it can solve this organizational weakness of Milei's political party. I think that's the main paradox of Milei's rise. He has the more ambitious program in the democratic era in Argentina, and with the less resources to apply it. So that's what I think we are witnesses. So messy and complicated situation in Argentina, and that will continue maybe if Milei achieved to win the midterm elections and to have more support in Congress, that will change. But I don't know. I think that it's not enough with the mainstream right to have this constitutional support, and that will remain as the dark side of the Milei's rise for a while. Thank you.
I think that's the question, Carlos. I mean, what is the democratic response to the challenges of crime and insecurity in Latin America, right? And is it because, and the question is, Bukele has prompted all these questions, and I've been in so many interviews about people asking me, so, but what's the alternative then? If not Bukele, what, right? And I think we have to make a sort of, accept something, that any solution to the problem of crime and insecurity because of the magnitude, because of the structural nature of the problem in our countries, it will take time. So there are no easy solutions, right? Or quick solutions. And that's part of the problem with when you deal with policymakers and politicians who want solutions, overnight. And if we are real on dealing with, those problems, those will take time. At some point, I have talked about the possibility, specifically talking about El Salvador, some areas of Honduras, in Guatemala, of coming up with a sort of DDR, right? Demobilization, disarmament, and rehabilitation program, right? Like the literature of peace talks, but dealing with these groups, organized crime groups, gangs, in which, okay, you negotiate with them with the purpose of their dismantling, right? Of them disappearing in exchange for huge programs of, insertion, rehabilitation, and huge investment, social investment which we hadn't had in Central America at all. I mean, all the investment have been going to security forces because the old-time operators have been very effective in convincing everyone that the best way is being tougher with crime and getting more, more money and increased budgets for that, but nothing for social investment. But you need to do that at the same time while you are, hitting crime, right? Otherwise, you're not going to solve the problems that generate gangs. And I'm telling you this. I mean, we're seeing the apparent success of Bukele now, but there's nothing being done in the communities or in prisons to stop the fact that those 70,000 people who are in prison now are not going to go back to the streets and create even more violence, right? There's nothing. So it's just having them over there until they die, or, having them forever. And that's not a solution.
I would like to extend my thanks to the three of you and the audience for the great questions on the conversation we had. It's 12 p.m., so according to the schedule, we'll wrap it up, but we can continue the conversation while we have lunch. So thank you all.